Greetings, everybody. My name is Clive Bates. I'm the Director of Counterfactual Consulting based in London and Nigeria. I'm here to talk about the WHO and FCTC. I've broken my presentation into 6 parts. Part 1 will discuss the basic health issue. Part 2, the WHO's response. Part 3, the FCTC and how all that works. Part 4, what is wrong with the WHO and FCTC. Part 5, how we might fix that, the solutions to the WHO and FCTC problems. And then Part 6, some thoughts on advocacy in this area. So I hope that sounds appealing. The first thing is the issue. The basic issue is that 1.1 billion people smoke. Around 1 in 2 of those will die prematurely. The death toll annually is around 8 million per year, and that's a lot. I mean, that compares with about 3.5 million dead from COVID so far. So it's big numbers. I'm not strictly comparable, but they're big numbers. 80% of smokers are in low and medium income countries, and just over half are in Asian countries. So it is a big issue for Asia, and it will become bigger as the smoking population ages and these diseases start to catch up with people. So how we respond to that is really important issue from a public health point of view globally, but particularly in Asia. Okay, part 2, the WHO response to this. Now, WHO has been on the case on tobacco for many years, many decades, in fact. And it has something called the Tobacco-Free Initiative, which has recently been renamed the No Tobacco Unit. And there's a problem even in the naming, because most of the trouble comes from smoking, not just tobacco itself. So there is although it's focused on tobacco, the real issue is smoking. We'll probably come back to that. The Tobacco-Free Initiative, or No Tobacco Unit, is part of WHO's Health Promotion Department. And interestingly, WHO defines health promotion as the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health. Now, it's very interesting because tobacco harm reduction, vaping, smokeless tobacco, heated tobacco products enable users to do exactly that. Yet so far they've received nothing but opposition from WHO. So there's an interesting conflict in what WHO philosophically defines as health promotion and how it actually practices in the area of tobacco control. Now, the No Tobacco Unit does a lot of interesting things. It's in charge of World No Tobacco Day every year on the 31st of May. It produces advice on taxation. It sponsors the TOBREG committee, and TOBREG is like a scientific advisory committee, but it's recently, for example, suggested the banning of open systems, to be honest, without much justification, and it has opined on things like EVALI with quite bad scientific advice, in my opinion. It also publishes statistics, including every 2 years a publication called the Global Tobacco Epidemic, in which it sets out what it sees as the problems and the policy response and so on. So it's providing reports and information, guidance on things like how to implement tax, to do litigation, and so on. Okay. It doesn't actually run the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Now, that's a surprise to some people, but that's now a separate entity, although it is housed within the WHO's headquarters. So, part 3 is the FCTC. Now, the FCTC was basically conceived in 1995. It was given impetus by a new Director General, Gro Harlem Brundtland, of the WHO in 1998. It was negotiated between 1999 and 2003, and it entered into force in 2005, once a number of countries had basically ratified and signed up to the agreement. It it's basically a kind of advisory framework for tobacco control. It doesn't really force countries to do anything, and it doesn't really have any significant sanctions if you don't. But it's there. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's there to create norms, to establish a pattern of responding to the tobacco the challenge of tobacco and smoking. So it has articles on taxation, on advertising and promotion, on warnings, on packaging, on smoking in public places, on illicit trade, and, basically tries to encourage countries to have a plan, to actually do something. And then it kind of marks their homework a bit by looking at who's done what kind of measures. So broadly, it's not a totally bad thing. It's trying to normalise good tobacco policy. The problem is it's basically gone off the rails when it comes to harm reduction. Now, the FCTC works through two main bodies, really. The Secretariat, which organises it, and the Secretariat is housed within WHO, but is not strictly speaking part of WHO. It's not funded by WHO, it's funded by something called the Conference of the Parties, which is 190 odd countries gather together, meet every couple of years, and they are the parties to the convention, and they basically make the decisions about what the convention's doing. The Secretariat prepares papers for that, for those meetings, and the next meeting will be in November, from the 8th to the 13th of November, held online this year because of COVID. The Secretariat prepares papers, and then the Conference of the Parties reaches decisions which are then published, which form a kind of rounding out of what the convention is actually supposed to do. Okay, now the trouble is those decisions. While the convention text really allows you to do anything and actually includes a reference to harm reduction. So Article 1D of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control suggests in the definition of tobacco control that harm reduction is part of it. The problem is that has never been actually operationalized through decisions or interpretation or guidelines in the convention, and actually the convention has taken opposite, much more hostile point of view. And this gets us to part 4 of this particular presentation, which is the problem with the WHO and FCTC. Now, basically, it expresses its approach. As I say, it doesn't tell anybody to do anything. It doesn't lay down the law, but it creates norms. And if you're a health official in an Asian country, you listen to what the WHO does and you kind of respond to it. So it has a whole way, both the FCTC and WHO have a whole range of instruments that they use for influencing policy. So there's the FCTC itself, but then there's decisions of the Conference of the Parties. There are papers that are inputs to the Conference of the Parties. There are statements made by WHO and FCTC officials. There are initiatives and reports produced by WHO, like guidance on tax policy or the report on the global tobacco epidemic. There are the themes chosen for World No Tobacco Day. There are awards given. So this year, India's health minister was given a World No Tobacco Day award on 31st of May for his work in promoting or securing the prohibition of e-cigarettes in India. So there's nothing in the FCTC text that requires that or says you should prohibit these products, but WHO is signalling that that is the right and virtuous thing to do. And it does this through all of the vehicles. You constantly see references to prohibition as if that is the normal thing to do with vaping products, heated tobacco products, and anything they can essentially get away with. I would say, so it's anti-tobacco harm reduction through all these different methods. It's also anti-innovation. So when e-cigarettes, vaping products, heated tobacco products come along, a realistic, sensible organisation that was driven by reducing health impacts would not like go on the defensive and say, oh, this is something we must stop, which is basically what they have done. You would ask the question, how do we exploit this to get the maximum health gain that we possibly can? Where are the wins for that we may need some safeguards, but how do we exploit this technology to reduce that 8 million persons a year death toll? Because that is definitely something that could be done with much lower risk products. So they just don't think that way. They haven't looked at the opportunity. They've only responded to a greatly inflated view of the risks, and that's a really serious problem. Then I think the final problem that I see with WHO and FCTC is that they've become fanatically anti-industry. And look, let's be honest, there's some reasons for that. The tobacco industry has been absolutely terrible in the past. It carries a terrible reputation for abuse and misuse of science. But if somebody is going to make vaping products or heated tobacco products or smokeless tobacco or nicotine pouches, all the non-combustible products, it's quite likely that the tobacco industry and other industries will be the ones doing it. I mean, these things don't get made by activist organizations. They're part of the consumer nicotine marketplace. I happen to think it's a good idea if the tobacco companies get out of the merchant of death business to the extent that they can, and that we move as quickly and as deeply as possible towards non-combustible products as the way that people use nicotine. And we've got the four basics for that: vaping products, heated tobacco products, smokeless tobacco products, and oral nicotine products such as pouches. If we could get everybody, or a substantial proportion of those 1.1 billion smokers using those products, we would just see huge cuts in the death toll as it plays out over the coming century. But WHO, for reasons that are hard to understand, rejects that as an approach, and that's a great shame in my view. Okay, so and I think a lot of that is to do with its innate hostility to the industry, and it can't get over this idea, and it has a principle that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and the interests of public health. But what if the tobacco industry is the way that you reduce smoking? And we've seen that in Sweden, for example, where smoking prevalence is around 5 to 7%, depending on how you measure it. And the reason for that is that smokers, instead of smoking, or tobacco nicotine users, use snus. And that's a product made by the tobacco. It's a tobacco product made by the tobacco industry. There's proof of concept there that you can reduce the burden of smoking-related disease using a tobacco product. So let me talk a bit about the solutions. Part 5, how should WHO and FCTC reform? Okay, now first of all, I would say focus on the right goals. The job here is to reduce as deeply and as fast as possible the burden of these non-communicable diseases: cancer, cardiovascular disease, respiratory illnesses, stroke, all the different things that are associated with smoking. So focus on harm, focus on the loss of life due to severe diseases, and that will incline you to do everything you can to move people from smoked products to smokeless products, because smoke is the main cause of harm. Okay, now the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, do focus on that. They're trying to get a deep reduction, a 30% reduction in non-communicable diseases by 2030. And if you stuck with that goal, you'd be really on the case for making a lot of progress. Okay. The second thing is to embrace innovation. I would love to see a working group set up within WHO, within FCTC Secretariat, to ask the question, how do we get as much as possible as we can out of these new technologies? Let's say our lives, that is health bureaucrats based in Geneva, depended on it, or our salaries, or our house, we'd have to give up our house, we'd have to give up our careers if we didn't meet these goals for deep cuts in non-communicable diseases or deep cuts in smoking. What would we actually do? And the answer to that is there was no way on earth that they would ignore these technologies. No way on earth. They would become very, very proactive when it comes to innovation if their own careers, their own lives depended on it. The third thing is, so this is the third part of my part 5 on the solutions, is embrace harm reduction. It's there in the FCTC. There is a regulatory framework for doing it, which is called risk proportionate regulations. And all it means is that you tax and regulate and communicate much stronger messages, much stronger regulation, much higher taxes for the smoke products, and you have a much more permissive approach to the smoke-free products. And what you're trying to do is use the regulatory framework to encourage people to migrate from high risk to low risk products. And that would be a perfectly implementable thing within the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It would just need WHO, FCT Secretariat and the COP to embrace that idea and go ahead and do it. Instead, they tend to focus on much more prohibitive measures, either prohibition, regulating these products as though they're medicines, regulating them as if they're no different to cigarettes, and that just gets you nowhere. I'd like to see better policy appraisal. This is the fourth area that I think WHO needs to improve. It's constantly recommending policies, but without ever looking at the perverse consequences of those policies. It must stop. Fifthly, it must stop pushing prohibition. It's the worst case. It's just a recipe for black markets, illicit products made to lower standards. If you make these products harder to get, the reduced risk products, people will continue to use the high risk products. It's a nonsensical proposal. It's never worked anywhere and it just shouldn't be done. Okay, so they've got to stop signalling that prohibition is a good idea. Sixth area for reform is they need to get a more diverse stakeholder group involved. WHO will only admit people to the FCTC if they are essentially positive about the FCTC and WHO agenda, and it won't allow things like consumer organisations, small trade associations. It only basically creates an echo chamber within the FCTC meetings, and that's a big mistake in my view. And then finally, seventhly, I just wish they'd show some leadership, really get some top-class people in and work out how to make all of this work. They're squandering a gigantic public health opportunity. Okay, sixth part for me, and finally, of this presentation is just a few words about advocacy. It's very hard to get directly into the WHO, the FCTC Secretariat. They're not really easily influenceable. They don't feel accountable, particularly to ordinary people, to any kind of groups. They are accountable, however, to the Conference of the Parties. So I recommend if you're in Malaysia, you deal with the Malaysian government. If you're in Indonesia, you deal with the Indonesian government, and you focus your energy on capitals. That's on the capital of, basically the health departments in your country. Secondly, start early. I mean, for COP9, which is in November, I would say start now. Okay, countries form their positions well in advance, and there'll be more to do in September. The WHO has to publish papers 60 days before the meeting, so that's around the 9th of September. But you can't start early enough in this game. Third thing I'd say is that your experience counts. Don't think that it all has to be very technocratic. It doesn't. If you've given up smoking or vaping has changed your life, you can say so, and that will influence politicians. I would say there are just unlimited things that you can do in this space. You can write letters to governments, you can write letters to newspapers, you can make it known to the delegates who go to the FCTC. My advice is to get busy. But my very final piece of advice, and this will help you get busy in a constructive way, help you to land your arguments, is to join a trade association or a consumer group. Trade association if you're a small business, or a consumer group if you're a vapor and you want to do something. Because they will help you orientate your way around the system and help you to land your experience with the people who count in the right way and at the right time. And a little bit of money put into those groups is a good idea. So pay up, get your hand in your pocket and pay some subscriptions. But that will help you to be effective. Okay, I'm going to wind up there. We've talked about the main health issues, WHO and FCTC. We've talked about what's wrong with WHO and FCTC. We've looked through the possible solutions, and I've given you some of my views on advocacy. And I look forward to follow-up questions when we discuss this actually in the live session. Thank you very much, everyone.